Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And it's all yours, Amariah.
Okay, thanks, y'all. Okay, so close that. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming. Yes, my name is Amariah. So currently, I actually work for the city of San Antonio as a planner. I work in the development services building, like where they do building permits and stuff, and I do plating. But I'm also, like in my free time, a community historian for SACAM. So that's kind of just, I'm not really doing like a particular like paper or project. I just like kind of have information that I give to Crystal, or like I'll kind of pass it along, or just like for my own understanding. So this is really like, I'm collaborating. I'm a community collaborator. So that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about today is GIS and how it can be a tool for your historic research, because there is a lot of census information that we use. There's a lot of like just old papers that now have been digitized. Some of it hasn't. So of course there's a lot of stuff that's still lost to history, but some of it has been digitized and we can use that, especially mapping. So
this is lecture 5 for y'all. So if you take the midterm, it's on the midterm. And it's for everybody. Even if you're doing the project, it's everybody's reporting on it for Sunday's lecture. And this is so cool that if you want to substitute her stuff for my project too after midterm, you're welcome to do that. So another incentive. This is the cutting edge stuff. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm giving y'all, along with this presentation, like I shared everything with Dr. Van Hoy, but this presentation plus a resource guide that y'all can use, plus just like I gave y'all my email and the resource guide. So if you have questions, you can just like contact me and ask me. So yeah, so let's get started. Okay, so first of all, does anybody like, do y'all know what open data is? No, yes, no. So open data is, government already are supposed to be transparent and make their records accessible. So like they already have rules and regulations around how long they keep certain records for. Some records are kept permanently. So when it comes to open data, that is an initiative like collaborated between governmental institutions, IT professionals, and like just community people. You guys are researchers, you're academics, so that also goes into the same categories like community people. And the whole thing with open data is they want to keep it transparent, they want to collaborate, they want to keep the institutions that create the data accountable, and there's like a social responsibility to just make the information known. And so that's why it's important that the data and the records that we keep are not only accurate, but accessible and able for the public to understand. Imagine if you did like a Freedom of Information Act on a document and everything in there was redacted. What was the point of it being accessible if you can't understand it? So open data is basically just like a global initiative set towards that. If you're a professional, you can engage with open data initiatives by maybe if you're like more of an IT person, you can develop and manage like data distribution softwares. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk to y'all about the Bexar County Open Data Portal, but there's like other types of like just the whole back end of how we collect this information. And you can do hackathons, which they're not like a legal activity. It's just like basically where a bunch of professionals or just IT people will get together and they will, maybe they have like a data set or a source of information, or maybe they're collecting information and then they're maybe scrubbing all of that data and they're making it usable. Maybe they're uploading all the data that they scrub to a particular like platform to make it accessible. It really just depends on the event, but it's kind of just like a public collaborative like kind of event that these people do towards open data initiatives. If you are someone who works with a community, you can basically like use data visualization tools. So the most common way that we would see that is like whenever you see people use like charts or graphs to say like, you know, this is how much food insecurity we have, or this is how much income we have. But you can do that with maps as well. And with maps, it's cool because you can show multiple different types of data in the same map just by having different colors and different points and shapes and things like that.
Next time you hear of it,
Yeah, I would look into that. So yeah, so and then the other part of it, because this is like having to do with open information is open source software, but making sure it's credible. So an open source is like a program that anybody can go in and change the source code of, but because this is like a collaborative, like community initiative, there are publishers and creators that will make an open source, but there's still like security measures involved, or it's like a very trusted, publisher. So one thing that you think about when you're thinking about like what is open source, how credible, when you're thinking about how credible is open source information, basically, are there people using it saying that it's credible? Are the people using it giving good feedback? Are they giving their contributions? Is the community of people around this particular software active? And by open source software, I mean like, let's say like we have Microsoft Office or like the Google Workspace. You don't have to use those two. You could use something called LibreOffice, which is like an open source version of like Word or PowerPoint. You could, instead of like, when I didn't have access to ESRI GIS program, I would use QGIS because that's an open source version of like a mapping software. So there's things out there. You kind of just have to do a little bit of maybe research to find out how established it is. When the people that are making the software, like if they are getting reports of bugs, you can see like how timely of a manner are they actually like fixing that? Like how often are they updating the different versions of the software? So there's a lot of like very technical things that you can figure out and learn about for how to know if something is credible and safe. If you go to this website here, it'll give you more information by like what I would say is a trusted source, because it's basically like a group of people that are coming together for best practices for using these things. So you could go to them and see what they say about that. But for our purposes, we want to know, how is GIS, open data, and digitized history going to help us with our research? So first of all, the thing that we want to acknowledge is that when you see a set of tabular data like this, where it's basically just, it's an Excel sheet, and you can see under these red lines, this Excel sheet is actually from like one of the Bexar County open sources that we're about to look at. So on here, you can see that it has first names, last names, gender, race. This is all like census data. It's like residence and employment data that whenever they wrote it down on a piece of paper back in 1897, they kind of already had it in a table form, but now we've digitized that. So if you see on the far left side, it has XY coordinates. That XY coordinate is how we're able to translate it into a GIS software. Because I can tell y'all there have been very many times where I find like maybe like a data set that has to do with like income or something like that. And I'm like, okay, I think this would be great to put onto a map. And I just upload it, I add the data in there, but it doesn't show up as anything. It doesn't connect to anything on the map because there's no coordinates that connect it to real places as we've digitized. So, and like all this XY coordinate stuff, that's like the backing of our Google Maps, the backing of our everything that you can see on a map. It needs to have some kind of attachment to it. So you can manually do that in a GIS software if you know how, but most like open data platforms that are already giving you the information, if they're giving you the shape files, it should already be attached and connected. And even in the one we're going to use, you don't even have to really download it if you don't want to. You could just you could look at everything in the website. So that's what I'm going to show you now. So Bexar County Open Data Portal, this is where they have hosted all of their digitized information, all of their data. Now, most of this information is going to be present day. So like the demographics, the maps of places and addresses, if it says like schools, a lot of that's going to be present day information. But they have digitized some historical information. So if I search historic in that search bar, it's going to pull up these 5 results. And so up here we have historic buildings from 1896, which is pulled from the 1896 Sanborn maps. The historic city blocks also pulled from the Sanborn maps. Then you also have points of interest, which is basically combining places that were identified on the Sanborn maps and also in the 1897 city directory. And then the last 2, which is Bexar County residences and Bexar County employment, This is all data that they collected also from the 1897 city directory. So these 5 mapping data sets come from real physical documents. They just digitized it and put it into a map. And so now we can use it for our research. So just for like an example, what I'm going to do with these, I'm going to show you kind of what this historic buildings looks like and what information you can pull from it. And then I'm going to kind of walk you through like an example of me doing research using a map, and like how would I go down the track of researching if I start with the map. So first of all, looking at this historic buildings 1896 Sanborn, if you look here on the side left, the purple, right now there's not really any filters. It has building type selected just because that's what it's showing visible on the map. It's showing all these buildings. They all have building types assigned to them in the tabular data. But if I wanted to filter them by only the dwellings, only the businesses, only the schools, I could do that, and it would take off all of these blue shapes that do not apply. And so in this red circle, I've clicked one, but keep in mind, like not all data sets are created equal. So this one, this is as close as I can zoom in. Like I can't really get more detailed than that. But if I click on one, it will still give me information, because it will tell me what was the building type. It was a business. The color code above that first purple line is blue. So that means like if I was looking at an actual Sanborn map, this area would be blue. And if I change some of these filters and if I change some of what was visible, I could even make some of these areas blue, and I could actually assign the correct colors to whichever building or whichever color code it is. And you could see that on the map as well. This is just, I've pulled it up to kind of be the most simple version. So from here, I can see that. I can see, okay, this address looks like 108 Commerce Street. It was 2 floors, did not have a basement. It was not vacant, and it was made of stone. So this is all information. Someone in Bexar County had a job where they had to take all of this source tabular data, connect it with XYs, clean it up so that it was all in the same format, and then put it into a map program. So this is basically the end form of doing all of that data work so that the public can use it. This is just like the final version for us. So it kind of just depends on how much technical background you have on like how to work it. We just live in a city, in a municipality that just has good information. So yeah, so this is just, what I've done here is I've expanded the table, not just to show me one row of a point, but to show me everything. And I could just scroll and scroll and scroll, and it'll show me everything that has a shape on the map. And so here, further again, you can see color codes, building types, addresses, and frames. I don't think this particular data set has the owners filled in, but the next set that we look at, it will have owner names. So this is more so good for like property information. So now if we look at the employment from 1897, so again, this is pulled from one city directory from one year. There were several different years of city directories. This is just one that we have digitized. When I open this up, this is still in the Bexar County website. I haven't downloaded anything yet. Nothing is filtered, but it is showing different colors based on what the column of occupancy says. So when we go back to this table, one of these tables says occupancy, and it's just sorting, it's giving different colors based on what the different rows say under occupancy. So there are a lot of gray values. That just means there's like a lot of different names that were put in. I know when I was searching through the tabular data, a lot of people were identified as porters, workers, house, like domestic, just different, like whatever they call like your job at the time. So I'm just doing like a very light basic search. I'm not even analyzing that deeply, and you're still going to be able to see how much information we can pull. So now in this slide, what I've done is I've zoomed in. Keep in mind, the city only existed up to this point in 1897. They did not really expand until like way later in like the 1930s. They didn't, this is all the city. So the things that stand out to me, once I have filtered by race and ethnicity, and I filtered all of the data sets or data points they're identified with B in their race category.
Black.
Yeah, all the Black people basically. I filtered them all out, and I've also given y'all a Excel sheet that has these in. So I've already filtered these out and I've extracted it into just like an Excel file for y'all. So you can go through and just look through the list. And that's kind of like the list of names that I work with when I'm like trying to do some research. And I haven't gone through all the names yet, but it'll be good for y'all's research. So when I'm looking at this map, the first thing that stands out to me is, where are there clusters? And not only clusters, but what colors am I most interested in? I'm personally most interested in Black people that were owners of something in 1897. So automatically I'm interested in the color yellow. I'm interested in the color purple. So when I look here, some of these, so this one in the middle, I would say this is like a cluster. This one also here, this one also here. But all of these clusters together, I'm seeing a trend that there's a lot of business activity by African Americans on Commerce Street. Now, that's just what the data says, but that does also align with what my historic knowledge of Black businesses in the city is. Like, I know that there was a lot of activity there downtown. Also, I was told, like, I was in like an interview with somebody, and they were telling me about like Sunset Station, so the whole kind of like St. Paul Square area. So that this tells me this might actually be accurate because it aligns with what I know about history here. I also am interested in outliers. So at the time, if this was the whole city, I'm interested in why this person all the way over here was working, maybe in a place where they did not live. Also, these people over here, also these people up here, going more towards like the Almost Park area. Those are automatic points of interest, so I want to know what they were doing out there. This data set does tell you if they were living and working in the same place. So that can tell you like not only where people working, but where were they living. I'm also interested in this yellow right here because what business were they owning all the way out here by themselves? And also these over here as well. So just for the example that we're going to look at right now, we're going to look at this one. At the time, they kind of would have been in like kind of like the southeast area. Now it's not as much, probably just like the regular east side, but at the time when the city was smaller, they're kind of an outlier. So I want to know who that is. Okay, so I click that point, and that brings up just the one data set for that particular point. His name is Lafayette Walker. He's identified as a male. He's Black. If I scroll down some more, he was running a blacksmith shop at 409 Nevada. And because his work address is the same as his residential address, I know that he lived and worked out of his home. So keep in mind, I just started looking into this person like for this. So like, we will see how much information we can pull from like just this kind of initial light information. And this is also in 1897. So keep in mind, blacksmith, 1897, Black male, Lafayette Walker. There's two
And owner.
and owner. Yeah, he owned this. This is his thing because it's yellow.
So this is what you can get.
Literally.
This whole associates. Okay.
So we can go down two tracks here. We can go for the person. We can go for the property. If I look at the property of 409 Nevada, when I looked it up online, on the current maps, 409, the street number does not exist anymore, but underneath an address is another identifier called a legal description. The legal description typically does not change even over hundreds of years unless the property gets platted. So even if I see that the addresses have changed, I can still look into the history of the property with different addresses just because of the legal description. So that'll come in a little bit later, but just keep that in mind. We could also go down the track of the person. So we have Lafayette Walker's name. So we don't really know how old he is, but in 1897, he has to have been old enough to run a blacksmith shop. So now let's see what we can find. When I looked into like the obituaries, like just doing like an initial search, I couldn't find anything, but I think I just needed to maybe know more about like maybe where he lived and died, because where you lived and died doesn't really tell you where you lived throughout your whole life. So he could have just been here for a certain period of time, or maybe he's from here and I just didn't find it. But when I look in the newspapers, I find way more information. So all I did was I look in my newspaper repository, which is the genealogy bank. Y'all use whichever one y'all think, you know, you have access to. But sometimes I do find that like the newspaper information can duplicate. So even if I'm using genealogy and you're using like newspaper archive, you could easily still maybe pull up the same information. So I looked up his name, San Antonio, Texas. I also sorted by oldest publication date. So I can see his name in 1871 in a newspaper. And I believe when I clicked that one, it was like a list of people who were nominated as like something political. They were nominated for something political. But when I go through more newspapers and I did some more searching, these are 3 articles that I pulled out that I felt like were important to give me some context for who is Lafayette Walker. So keep in mind, we started at 1897. He's a blacksmith, supposedly. And assuming this is the same person, because there's still always plausible deniability that we could be talking about different people, but we'll take down the track for right now. 1885, he's identified as being in a meeting at a Democratic convention. And when I read this whole long article, the rest of it, it's talking about basically Judge Devine was calling the meeting in absence of someone else who was supposed to.
So anybody doing Judge Divine as you're in slavery here? Is this? Yeah, no? Okay, then must be the.
Somebody, but okay. So Judge Devine, he was trying to run this, and what was happening in this particular article was he was trying to get different people to like, I guess, speak, and each person kept refusing. So it was like, okay, AJ Houston was called next. He refused. Bergstrom called someone else. They refused. Then someone, like a spectator, just got up and was like, as an independent citizen of the city, I move that Lafayette Walker be asked for speech. The room kind of got loud. Everybody was murmuring. Everybody was telling that person to sit down. And that's the response that person got. And they moved forward with asking people to speak and people refusing. Like, I'm pretty sure it was like a really long article. I'm pretty sure at least like 10 people refused to speak. So I don't know what was going on. We would have to do some more research to figure out what was the context of this particular 1885 Democratic Convention. Why were they in conflict, and why was Lafayette Walker? Why was it that just this one person wants them to speak, but everybody else is against it? And like, what is he representing for that to be the response? So that's like already I have questions that I could go down more. The next article I found was in 1889. He is talked about as speaking at the 24th annual Freedmen's Day. So this article is just talking about kind of what the community did that day. There was an Oddfellows procession on Franklin Square. And then later on, they went down to the Springs, which they identified as Fest's Garden. And then, you know, they all were kind of doing like, there's different sports and kind of spring activities happening. And then Lafayette Walker is identified as a speaker. So based on these two, I'm gathering that Lafayette Walker may have been like a political figure or like some kind of leader in the community. In this second article, he's identified as a colonel. So maybe he was in the military. Why he wasn't identified as a colonel 4 years prior, I don't know. Maybe something happened. Maybe they just weren't like respecting him. Who knows? We'd have to, those are questions that we can answer through more research. And then this last one is basically Henry Clay Smith. This is a person in the community who's basically, and by the way, this is 1897. Oops. This is also in 1897. So the same year that Lafayette is identified as a blacksmith, this is kind of, he's brought up in this conversation because this person is airing a grievance with the local African-American community, saying that they feel like the community does not come together for political things united enough. And as they're like reflecting on the upcoming Freedmen's Day, they're like disheartened because of this. And so the reason why Lafayette Walker gets brought up is because he's basically saying, I was appointed to this first committee in I think it says 1866. It could say 1886. I'm going to say it says 1866, but the thing is, if this number that is really small says 1886, it kind of gives me a little bit more like context, because he's saying that in 1886, this is after a civil war with Lafayette Walker. So that tells me maybe something happened in 1885, which is this discord that we're seeing in the first article. And then in 1886, that led him to be like newly appointed to a community, and maybe Lafayette Walker left. So there was maybe like discord and separation. Already, I have questions about, again, what was the conflict? Why? What was Lafayette Walker representing that the other political actors were not into? And if it wasn't this 1885 situation, what is the situation before 1866 that happened that caused them to, like, that sounds like there more discord? I don't know. I have questions. We have more research to do. So automatically, like, just these 3 articles, I have all of these names, situations, and places that I can follow up on that might enrich my context, but also like my research of what I'm trying to learn. So those are just things that I found going down the person track from that map that I found. So that's just like an example. And if I wanted to find like more information that would like inform me, these are just other sources of information. So you can go down the property track and look at land and zoning records. You can do open records requests. I'll talk about that in a moment. Legal records, military service records. There's also photos. So like, of course, like I know y'all's class is focused on like post-emancipation time period. And so as you get later into time, like obviously more things become available. But if you want context for like, okay, what were these people doing like after, or like what position were people in some time period after that, photos can still very much help because you can just do analysis, like what fashions am I seeing? What is going on in the picture? Who is there? What status symbols am I seeing? What locations and like quality of structure am I seeing? And that can give you a lot of like insight, even if you can't pinpoint it to a specific person. So these 2 pictures, for example, this couple from 1919 and this military, it's Camp Travis in 1918. These are soldiers that are like newly into the military, and they're being taught how to read. I found both of these pictures on a auction website, and especially for the military one, it gave me like a lot of context for like what was written. It was like what was written on the back, which says that it's these guys that are in the military that are fresh, like they're being trained and they're learning how to read. And it even says like what the sentence is that they're trying to read. And then it also says that this building was specifically for the African American soldiers to like learn and train in. So if I'm doing military history, and I'm like, okay, I want to know more about Camp Travis. Well, now I know that there were Black people there in this particular building getting trained in 1819, and what happened before, what happened after that. So this is just more so like context information. The next couple things I'm going to talk about are more like, it's going to be helpful for this class, but also if you ever just have other history, like inquiries that you're on, like for even later time periods, the later the time period it goes, the more the data actually is helpful. And then as we go down more like of this list, I just assume that y'all already are aware of like newspapers, cemeteries, city directories, vital records, obituaries, and Sanborn maps. So I just assume that y'all are smart and y'all know about those things, but I still put them on the list.
Okay, so you are go in here and click about the city, find the group. So if anybody's doing anything, John, you heard me say Houston, right? Let's say Houston's son, Andrew Jackson Houston, he was in a slavery, money over, and suddenly y'all might be working on him. When you go into these photos and these records that he has and pop it right in your film. And also I gave my lecture, y'all remember, on World War One last week. And I talked about San Antonio, but I didn't know last week that Black soldiers were posted here. None of my sources had that. I found out this week from Amariah that Black folks not only here, but they're unfortunately segregated, right? This is a building just for them. And that what we can see here is emancipation has happened already 50 years ago. But these adult males are not learning to read, even though the first thing they did was build schools. So what happened? There's just so much that Amaria's sources can bring to what you're doing, but also what the historical understanding is. So, Michaela, for you as a history major getting ready to go to the conference for Rice, this is where you should be. Is that very Go ahead, Fraser.
On the vital records, what year, if you're aware, when they started collecting birth certificates and such?
So I I don't have the first year that they started, but from what I read from so like a lot like the retention schedules of public records for like the Texas government, birth records are meant to be kept permanently. So I would say I know that the Bexar County clerk records, like they have like marriage licenses and stuff, and I know they go back pretty far. So I would say the birth records also should. I can look into that more, but from what I understand, they should go back super duper far. I think even census information is kind of like supposed to supplement that as well. But keep in mind, like through history and things, I know a lot of that stuff can still be lost, but the vital records should be in there because it's meant to be kept permanently. And I believe that became a rule in the 70s. So hopefully that answers your question. Sorry. But if you go to I'll talk to you about the open records requests, and that's exactly like the type of thing that you can go and ask them about and say like, do you have any birth records from this time of this person? And that's just like open records request. Okay, so yeah, City of San Antonio open records. So this is okay. So I work for the permits building, right? And whenever people come in and they need information about their property from any time, they can technically do an open records request. And open records, again, like they don't go back, like they're not going to go back like all the way far. Like Bexar County goes back to 1800 with deeds. Open records, it depends on what you're asking for. So like when you fill out this, you have to make an account here, but it's free. If you make an account and then you click this open records and then you come over here and you fill this out, you don't necessarily need to look for, police records, but when you select like what type of information is being requested, it can say like zoning, it can say vital, it can say parks and recreation, it can say office of historic preservation. You are not always like, it's not everybody that does this is going to be asking for historic information. So even if you wanted like emails from a certain department, technically you can ask for that. But for y'all's purposes, you can say like, I need to know what's the earliest information that you have for this person or like this type of thing. You can even say, I don't know. You can even tell them I don't know and give them details of what you are looking for. I also have a contact that you can just reach out to directly. His name is James Saucedo. He works for the open records for my department. And so like our building records, from what I understand, they won't keep records for buildings that have been demolished. But if they're supposed to keep them for 100 years or the lifetime of the building. So that means like if you see a building and it's like, even if it's like super, super ran down, it's old, you can see maybe how long has that building been there for. There may or may not be permits for it. I was also told safety inspection document, you could ask for that. That can sometimes be very helpful. So it kind of just depends, but on the resource guide that I gave y'all, there is like not only my email, but there's also James's email. So y'all can reach out to them if you have like specific questions about stuff like that. Because we have the municipal office of open records, but then we also have the Bexar County clerk records. So those are like two separate institutions of population records. So yeah, so just some more like very important dates. So 1800, that's probably about as far back as you'll be able to go for deeds. Plats, you can go back as far as like 1838. And plats is going back to what I was saying earlier, where if you have an address that was changed over time, you can still keep track of the same property, not with the address, but with the plat and with the legal description, because on the plat, that is what has legal description. So legal description is an NCB number, a block number, and a lot number. The NCB is like the area, the block. Sometimes they'll have a block number, sometimes they won't. That's just like the block. And then the lot is the specific property that maybe has a house, maybe doesn't have a house, but you can keep track of what that lot number is. The only time a legal description will change is if someone comes to plat the property, they've hired a civil engineer, even if it was all the way back in 1820s, or 1920s, they hired a civil engineer, they platted the property, the legal description changed. But even on that plat document, you can still keep track of like what it was before then.
This is where I wanted to help them understand. That sounded very technical, this, block number and NCB and all that stuff sounds a little technical, but I want y'all to know what your predecessor history haters will accomplish with just that. One of them found, because he because he knew, the plat, he knew the lot. He found that the person, the enslaver he was looking at had been working his enslaved people on what is today Fox Tech's football practice fields. Because even though obviously that's not a rural property anymore, agricultural property, that it's still that same land. Another kid found that an enslaver had owned what is today San Antonio Airport with the runways. And that was where the workers were. So when you're trying to imagine, okay, where are my enslaved people trying to recover their lives, you're saying, well, they were farming in what is today this runway. So being able to remain constant with the land gives you the chance to map. Here's where my enslaved person was
Yes.
on this day in this, in this heat. And it's a powerful tool, and I appreciate you
Yes.
really taking time to clarify how to do it.
So yeah, it is like,
I was just curious, is that the same for looking at, where, like, say, like, for example, thinking about I-35?
Yeah.
Where I-35 came
Yeah.
through.
We used to live there.
yeah, there's definitely like when I'm at work and I'm helping people with their properties, there's definitely instances where like they're trying to develop on one property and I have to tell them like, okay, so on this old map from 1918, the block used to be a full rectangle, but now you see how this like drainage or this highway or this frontage road like kind of cuts diagonally on that. It's because this thing was built. And so now your property is just like what's left of that. So yeah, that's definitely something that we can track. It does kind of like take knowing what those like legal descriptions and survey numbers and the plat, tracking the plats all the way back. But it's definitely possible. I do it at work sometimes. And what's the other part? Oh yeah. Usually a property, if you see a legal description that is like, let's say it's NCB number block 12. I mean, block lot 12. If I see a deed, like if it's like that right now, and then I see a deed from 1908 or 1847 that says the same lot 12, then that tells me that that property, whether there's a building there or not, that tells me that the property has not changed all those years. So that's something that is like when it comes to keeping a property consistent and looking at the information, you don't have to always like expect that you're going to look through changes. Sometimes you're looking at things that have really stayed the same for a long time. Just nobody has really come and like done anything with it. So it just hasn't had a reason to change. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff where, if you want to contact me for help, you definitely can, because that is a little bit more of like in the weeds of property. But yeah, even open records requests are great for that stuff too. So yeah, and then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the National Historic Geographic Information System. So this is an open data initiative organization where they have taken a whole bunch of census information, digitized it, made it publicly available, made it in the right format that it needs to work. They've uploaded it onto this platform. And there's different types. They've separated it out into different things. So the ones that would be relevant for you would be, of course, like the census data that goes back to 1850, the summary census information that goes back to 1790, and then depending on what kind of project you have, like even if it's like outside of the class, just anything, if you're doing anything that's like from 1930s or after, there's going to be like, I think it's part of like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but it's like work information. It's called like time use, but it's about like how are people using their time? Were they agriculturalists? Were they in manufacturing? Like what were they doing? And so that was kind of kept track of since the 1930s. But yeah, so you can basically, so when people are doing like this mapping stuff, they are taking these data sets. This is just Excel sheets, a bunch of Excel sheets with a bunch of information that they've digitized, attaching XYs to it, and putting it on a map. All of these are just source tables, but you see that they do have GIS files that they offer as well. So it just depends on what you're looking for. Right now, this is not filtered, but there are filters that you can use. It just depends on like the different types of censuses that have been taken over time. So it can go by what population information you're looking for nationwide. You can go by just specific time periods. This one is sorting by like specific databases over here. So the ones that I would focus on, since we're looking for very old data, and old data is not going to be as specific. So like nowadays, how we have like, education status, income, are you in a rural area? Do you drive to work? Like all of these different questions are not going to be in there. A lot of the older stuff will have like totals, like the total amount of agriculture in this Bear County, or they might even have like who was enslaved or who was not, like in this county at this time. And it may not be like specific people, but it might just have counts. The way that counts can be helpful, like totals, is if I'm comparing two different totals of a similar time or even a different time, maybe I'm going ahead and using those numbers to make averages, or maybe I'm just using it to give me context for what exactly I'm like. Maybe I have a narrative that I've been working on, like with all these other like newspapers and everything, but I need context for like what was going on at the time, how much agriculture was happening if I'm looking at an agriculturalist, things like that. It kind of just really depends on what you're looking at, but this is supposed to be very like informative for that kind of stuff, because as you can see, they're only clocking population, agriculture, and other data in the US, states, and counties. So of course, you can still pull inferences from that though. So it kind of just depends. I would say the more later in time you go, the more the data gets helpful, because the more specific it gets, the more things that we're keeping track of as like a institution of the United States. So yes, okay. So that's basically all of my information. But if y'all have questions, you can definitely let me know. The resource guide has a bunch of stuff up there, so, and my email.
If you ever have people, if any of you want to do more with maps and ArcGIS and play with this data and maps, we have about 10 accounts that we could share with students. So you can point them my way if they want to play more with the map side of it.
And you can also take Dr. Wick's public reports, which does a lot of this great stuff. Very good. Hey, so questions, all right? You can come right on and you can say, yo, I'm working on this. What of your stuff can help me out? Because I have storyboards due on Sunday or something. Who's got a question for her? Rico, any question for you?
Well, it was very interesting presentation. My storyboard is about Ira Sullivan Ford and Elizabeth Dyer. So what would you suggest would be a good starting point, like to look into about their lives and how their relation to the slave industry?
So based on the fact that you just have like their names, you can definitely, like, depending on the time period that you know that they were in San Antonio, you could even look in that resource, the Excel sheet. I filtered it by all the Black people, but you could even just search the names of everybody in there and see if they pop up and what they were like identified as. Let me see.
The other thing is that they squatted in a house on Main. They just moved in some Mexican American person's house. Right as the. So, you know about, for example, one included in this map, this is where they squatted. Like, how would you pull up a property representation of who owns what around Main Plaza in 1848? I think they squatted, right? 1848.
So 1840. Okay. So give me 1 second. So this is what I would do. One of the other things that I did not mention, but is on your resource guide. How can I make this like smaller?
It's always.
Okay. Well, I'm just gonna like move it out the way. Okay. So one other thing. This is how I look and see if there's a legal description for something, and maybe how I would go back.
Let's share the.
Okay, so we'll see if it I'll see if I can find some information, but let me try. So this is the city of San Antonio's one-stop map. I use this at work a lot, but it can be helpful for this as well because it has that legal description information on it. This is like an aggregate of like all the data that we have, and like also that gets updated, like even like currently active plats and stuff. So what area was it? Do you have like
Main Plaza.
Main Plaza?
Right. what's in the city hall.
Okay, so all of this downtown area was definitely, so, okay, because it was already in the city at the time, like that we're talking, it's not like some outlying area or anything. This definitely has gotten redeveloped, but we can still work backwards. So do you know like which part of this like street? You said by,
It's
okay,
on the northeast side. They come took over somebody's house and ran warnings.
okay. So I'm gonna take the, can I just take this point as an example right here? So I'm gonna take this lot, 126 East Main Plaza. The legal description is this right here. It's NCB number. It has a circle number. I don't know even what that means. And then the west 108 feet of circle 5. So, and what's crazy is we're just doing this. I've never even seen a legal description have the word circle in it, but I think that just represents lot. Yeah, it's that's as old as right. So what I'm still gonna do is I'm still gonna look this up in the deed records. So I'm gonna take this legal description and I'm gonna you see this like property ID? When you click that, it takes you to the Bexar County property records. And this is the current property record for this property. Okay, so it's still, we're still not historic yet, but I can see deed records. It's gonna show me the last 3. The last 3 deeds available. So let me just go to the oldest one, because usually once I get to this part and I'm like, okay, how can I go back before this deed, and also like when was this, because the information's missing. Yes, I'm just gonna look up this volume and page. So this is a deed reference number. Reference can go to the Bexar County Public, oh, that's still searching, okay.
Oh, yeah, we have flow in there too.
Yes. A little bit. So the Bexar County official records. So this is the land records. This is how you find deeds. If I, oops.
They recognize this, but it's not-
Yes, exactly. So same place. This is how I would find, wow. Okay, this is how I would find plats, marriages, assumed names, properties, all those things. So I'm just gonna search that deed and see like what it says. I can also just directly search the legal description. Maybe I should do that instead. But I want to see what the deed says, because sometimes the deed will have reference information. Okay, so where was it? Here, 4737882.
skills that. Like, it's not. Our traffic being-
Right. I put that in? Okay, well, so let's see what that pulls up. But basically, when I read the deed, sometimes it'll say, like, I can keep going back and back and back because I can look at the owners. I can go owner to owner, owner to owner, until I get to the earliest one and I can see what land is that purchase describing. Or I could look up, oh, okay, so let's see. So this is from 1990. Okay, so in 1990, it was probably already like that's still too recent, right? So, but what I can do is I wanted to know, because it was missing, what was missing here was who bought it, but who did they buy it from? So they bought it from, if it loads again, the person that was right here.
So that would be the new piece, and then you go back.
And then I go back. And so then I want to look, okay, maybe I search up that name and I say, okay, like, who did they buy it from? Or like, which deed shows that they are a grantee? And this is where, like, sometimes open records can come for Bexar County, because not everything they have is digitized either. There are some times I tell people to go find a deed or something and they can't because it's not digitized, but if they go in person, maybe it'll be there.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so that's always like a thing. Okay, so yeah, so Morris Apartment Partnership. Okay, let's look that up. Now this is probably a developer. They're probably gonna have a lot of properties. So what I keep track of to know is this the property that I'm looking for is going back to the legal description. So this is supposed to be whichever property they'll have that identifies NCB 146, or it's describing like these 2 lots or this lot. That's what I'd pretty much be looking for. So let's look up that owner name. And you can kind of just go back and back and back. You can also just look up the direct legal descriptions and it'll pull up all of the owners for that, you know? So maybe I should do that. That might be honestly more efficient. So let's try it that way. So this is,
Now, this is. Honestly, you,
yeah.
this is how it's done.
If y'all ask me for help, this is what I'm pretty much probably gonna do. I'm gonna do something like this.
You know, you're like, you didn't hurt there. And so, that's what it is. So like you think, you know, then you're going, why next year, pick it this, and then you shut something else. They still have the market, right?
So when I searched this, I pulled up lots 1, 4, and 5, or sorry, 3, 4, and 5, just because like this says 3 and 4, or wait, no, this says 4 and 5, but the deed on the other one said lot 3. So, hey, we don't know what's gonna pop up. Let's find out.
Sorry about our slowness.
It's okay. I'm hoping I can find something. Okay, so now all this popped up. This is all like other different types of documents. So the first thing I usually do is I kind of just want to see the deeds. Maybe deeds of trust can help too sometimes. It's like a slightly different type of deed.
And the bills of sale are XODs, and they are grantees of the original slaver.
Mm-hmm.
So you're
So, yeah.
already familiar with.
So even this, like, we're looking in this one, depending on, I don't know like all of the ins and outs of how Bexar County separates like those kinds of deeds from these kinds of deeds, are like more modern. I don't know if they like put them in different categories and stuff, but that's like the kind of thing that we like can find out.
No, they don't.
They don't, they just put them all together. Yeah.
Like if you look up Bellinger, the slaver in the 50s, and then you go all the way to
Okay.
So yeah, it's all the same.
Yeah, so they should pull up. So basically, like, then with that being said, like if you don't see something here, maybe it doesn't exist, maybe it's not digitized.
Well, thank you. We don't. You get something cool for your project.
And even this is telling me it only goes back to 2005. So that tells me like maybe something changed, or even if it was like part of a different like a combined set of properties, even it just tells me. It's like questions to be answered.
The other questions like how gender plays out in her mapping Black San Antonio.
How does gender play out?
Okay, gender. So one thing that stood out for me, like when I was doing some of like the looking through like that Excel sheet with all of the Black people that owned something or like were working, I did call out 2 people that were women that owned like they worked at their house, but it's because their house was a boarding house, they were renting it out. But it wasn't like their husband listed or like they're listed as like the spouse or anything. Like it was literally the owner. And so one of them was Sally Royal, which I know that like Crystal has information about that she recently found. And then the other woman, I haven't really looked into her yet, but that is like, that for me, really like adds to a narrative that I believe about San Antonio, which is that there was a lot of like very like successful people, a lot of Black people that were doing things that if you look at the historic narrative in general for the United States, you would think like, okay, how would a Black person be successful at this time? But here in San Antonio, like they kind of actually were able to, depending on what they were doing and depending on who they were. So like I'm thinking, okay, how would this woman be like owning a property, potentially owning a business in 1897, and she's African American? Like how would that be able to be? Because like I'm thinking about like all the limitations that I have like expected upon those types of people during that time period. But clearly she was able to. So once I like learned more about her and I find out who she was, I think Crystal said like she had like a sister in like what state? Or like her sister was looking for her?
Her daughter, but I don't think it's the same
Oh,
person.
you don't think the same person?
No.
Or
Now-
we're still
yeah.
questions that we're still answering. Questions that we're still answering. Yeah, but basically like it kind of just gives us context for who were they, and at the time in their life that they were doing this particular thing, where were they coming from? What were they doing? Like, So I just think that yeah, that's pretty much how I'd answer it. Like, it just lets me know that even if I find information about a woman back in the day, I shouldn't not just assume that she was like ridden of like just for her gender, like she can't do anything and she wasn't able to be successful and she was only like in one lifestyle. It's possible that she wasn't. Like, clearly people in San Antonio have kind of just been doing whatever as they can throughout the whole entire time. Our civil rights got kickstarted before the national like time that civil rights started. Integration started before integration started nationally.
Yeah.
And yeah, stuff like that. So I just feel like it's kind of a unique place in that way. And so when you're looking at the data, you're trying to get even context for information. You don't have to just go with what the narrative is generally accepted, because you might find information that contradicts that because we're looking at such a small local scale. But you also might find information that goes along with that. So it's just about like finding the information and figuring out exactly what it is. So yeah, hopefully y'all are not more confused than we started.
No,
But-
we love that, we think it's, thank you so much. And yeah, so this is the new thing, where this is going, you don't have to be a teacher, you don't have to, you can, the world's your oyster, and I'm so happy that y'all are here and getting a sense of what's possible.